With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today, Mr. Chris Frenz. He's the AVP of Information Security for Interfaith Medical Center, where he worked to develop the hospital's information security program and infrastructure. Under his leadership, the hospital has been one of the first in the country to embrace zero trust model for network security. Christopher has also played a role in pushing for the adoption of improved security standards within hospitals and the author of the OWASP Secure Medical Device Deployment Standard, as well as the OWASP Anti-Ransomware Guide. Christopher has been recognized as a rising star among healthcare executives and also a top healthcare IT leader by Becker's Hospital Review. Christopher's security expertise has been highlighted in the Financial Times, CSO Magazine, SC Magazine, and many other publications. He shares his expertise at conferences around the world, including presentations at VMworld, ASIX, GSX, DEF CON, and many others. He's also an author of the computer programming book, ProPerl Parsing and Visual Basic for visualbasic.net for scientists and engineers. So I'm going to do a couple things before I hand the mic to him. One, if you could, please mute yourself unless you have a question for Christopher. And Chris, just to tee up, are we going to have time for Q&A at the end, or would you rather have people hold their questions or ask as we go?
I actually have more slides, and I probably have time to even cover, so I'm going to go through some quick and probably skip a few. But if people have questions, I don't mind if they chime in and ask. It's no problem.
Okay, great. Well, with that, I think we're lucky to have Chris join us today. And Chris, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. And as I mentioned, there's probably more content here than we'll have time to go through, but I will make my slides available as a PDF after the talk. I'll send them to everybody on the email invite, and any questions, feel free to follow up later on as well. So today we're going to talk about zero trust and medical device cybersecurity. And I'm going to breeze through the introductory slides. We basically all work in healthcare. We all know that healthcare cybersecurity really is in critical condition. There's not a lot of security talent in a lot of hospitals. A lot of hospitals are missing security professionals totally. There's a ton of legacy equipment, particularly in the medical device area. We're all dealing with meaningful use 3 and being required to bring more and more systems online without, in a lot of cases, identifying the security risks and security implications of bringing all those systems online. A lot of these vulnerabilities do directly impact patient care, and a lot of medical devices in particular are very, very rife with vulnerabilities. Additionally, you have a big case where compliance in hospitals is often a focus, but security may necessarily not be a focus. And what a lot of people fail to understand is that security and compliance are sometimes related, but they're not the same thing. I kind of view compliance as kind of shooting for a D grade in the classroom. So if you're trying for HIPAA compliance and you want to stop there, you might be checking all the boxes, but you're not really doing a good job keeping your organization secure. And a lot of the problems we see in hospitals today is that focus on compliance without really focusing on security, because you can pretty easily be compliant and still be insecure. Okay. And a lot of this was proven with some of the recent cyber attacks from last year. We all remember WannaCry, the NotPetya attack. They basically wiped out hospitals around the country. And one of the things that was most disturbing was WannaCry actually not only took out information systems, but they actually took out a lot of medical devices within a lot of hospitals. And as far as I'm concerned, that brings a whole new and wholly unacceptable meaning to the term denial of service. Now, if we look at a lot of these attacks, one of the dangers that made a lot of WannaCry and NotPetya and SamSam and all kinds of other ransomware attacks so effective within hospitals is a lot of hospitals still have highly flat networks, where basically every device in the network can talk to every other device on the network. And that's a big, big problem. We'll see in a lot of cyber attacks, lateral movement is a huge issue. And we'll take an example of SamSam ransomware attack last year. There was Erie County Medical Center. When the attackers finally launched their attack because they were able to move laterally through the network, they were able to take out something like 6,000 computers in a matter of 4 minutes. And we're seeing that time and time again, how these flat networks are playing a real danger in terms of how hospitals survive cyber attacks. Now, there's lots of things we can do to improve security to combat malware. One of the guides I'm one of the authors of it is the OWASP Anti-Ransomware Guide. That does provide a lot of defense in-depth strategies for protecting against malware and other threats. It includes something about 45 controls that you can put in place to protect against, prevent, mitigate, and respond to ransomware attacks. So that's a fairly useful resource. We're not going to go through every control in that guide in depth, but I do want to focus on one particular area of control. And before we get into a lot of the network segmentation that the guide covers, I want to go through my justification for how basically I decided to go about doing zero trust within my own organization. One of the things I'm very, very big on is performing mock incidents. I'm a real believer that mock incidents are a great way to help you identify weaknesses in an incident response plan. They help you identify deficiencies in security controls, and they help to ensure that staff can effectively and efficiently respond to an incident. So think about it this way. The first time you test your incident response plan, it's much better off to test it in advance of a real incident to work out any kinks in the plan then. You don't want to find that a real incident actually happens and suddenly a whole area of your response plan wasn't addressed. You're going to fail to remediate a system or mitigate the damage or some other major weakness because you've never run through that plan before. Mock incidents are a great way to find those errors ahead of time and make improvements to your incident response plan. Mock incidents, especially if you simulate them and don't just do tabletop, they can also be a great way to help identify deficiencies in security controls. So you might buy that really expensive firewall or whatever else, you put it in place, but unless you actually go ahead and test it, do you really know that all those rules are in place properly? Are they working properly? And that holds true for pretty much any security control. So simulating a lot of incidents provides a great way to actually test to make sure the security you actually have in place is actually sufficient enough to stop an attack. And lastly, time is critical when any incident occurs. The faster you can identify and respond to an incident, the more and more your damage is going to be mitigated and the better off you're going to be. So running through these scenarios in advance will help improve staff response time and will give you a much better response to any incident in which damage will be mitigated and it'll be much faster recovery time, everything else much, much better for the business. So running through simulated incidents is a great way to test security, something I'm very big on. Now, just some basic coverage of what incident handling is. There's 6 main phases to incident handling. There's the preparation, which hopefully you do pre-incident. That's where you figure out your incident response plan, figure out what you're going to do to respond to different things. Then after you have your incident response plan, when incident starts to occur, first step is really to begin to identify the incident. Figure out that you actually have an incident ongoing. Then figure out what you can do to contain the incident, how you can eradicate the incident. So containment basically mitigates the damage. Eradication is eliminating the threat from your environment. And then you have the recovery phase where you try to restore the business back to its pre-incident type functionality. But the most important part, I think, about the incident handling plan is actually the lessons learned. So basically, you look at the incident, you look at why it occurred, you look like at what it could have been done better. What could you change to improve your response to that particular incident? And then you take those lessons learned and you put them back into your preparation. It's a cycle. And you use that to improve your incident response plan. So when the next incident happens, your response is faster, it's better, your containment's more effective, things like that. And this is another area in which mock incidents are great because they force you to run through this incident response plan ahead of time and to dramatically improve how your organization is going to respond to an incident. So this is something I'm very, very big on, doing simulated mock incidents, doing red team type exercises like this. And one of the early exercises that we did here, going back to 2015 or so, is I decided to simulate what a mock mass malware outbreak would look like within the organization. And one of the ways we did this is we made use of what's called the ICAR test file. Now the ICAR test file, it's this string of somewhat random looking characters right here. And you see in the center, it says ICAR standard antivirus test file. Now it's a harmless string of characters. If you were to give this a .com extension on a Windows machine and execute it, it would basically print ICAR standard antivirus test file to the command prompt, and that's pretty much it. That's all the file does. But the interesting thing about this file is it may be harmless, but years and years ago, all the antivirus makers got together and they agreed to recognize this particular file as a virus. So it provides a really great way to test antivirus software, test security setups, because the file is harmless, but it will get flagged as a virus. So we want to use this as a basis to test our systems within our organization. And what we wanted to evaluate was, number one, how well our AV software was able to detect the outbreak, And number two, how quickly, and probably more importantly, staff would be able to identify, respond to, and control the outbreak. So in order to simulate a mass malware outbreak, one of the things I did is I wrote a Perl script that accepted a listing of all the computers within the organization. So basically exported from AD into a file, had a list of all the computer names within the organization, and this script was used to feed a Perl script that was then going to take that ICAR test file and copy it to each PC on the list. And then the program PS-execute was called within the Perl script to basically execute the ICAR test file on each PC in order to ensure the antivirus software was triggered. Now, this script was executed without the knowledge of other staff members, including IT. It was only myself and the CIO who knew. No other IT staff member knew this was ongoing. No other hospital employee knew this was ongoing, because you wanted to get a really realistic evaluation of how the organization would respond to a real attack. And it yielded some very interesting results. So just to give you a feel for what happened during the outbreak, this is a screenshot of our enterprise antivirus console that we're using at the time. And you can see here, here's a list of computer names. And in the alert column, it says virus/spyware detected. So you can see the Perl script is successfully copying the ICAR test file to PCs, and it's beginning to trigger alarms on all the PCs within the organization. Now, some of the lessons we learned. We'll focus on the positive first. Now, one thing I was happy to see is IT staff members did identify the outbreak. They did track down the source of the infection, basically the PC that was running the Perl script that was copying the ICAR test file to all the other PCs, and they were able to remove it from the network. So they handled the identification, the containment, and other phases of the incident response very well. And the other interesting thing that this test yielded in terms of positives was many of our in-place security features did stop the spread of the infection to parts of the network. At the time, we did have network segmentation, not as extensive as we do today, and I'll get into that more, but at the time we did have network segmentation in place, and it was mostly access control lists that were present between VLANs. So VLANs weren't allowed to talk to each other. So for example, finance PCs couldn't talk to PCs on the medicine VLAN and that type of idea. So that actually was fairly effective at containing the outbreak. The other thing that was actually interesting that popped up, a little more minor, but is the images for our physical desktop PCs and for our VDI desktops were done by two different engineers. And we did identify some security configuration differences between the two images that made the VDI desktops a little more resistant to this scenario than the ones present on our physical desktops. So we're actually able to take this information and use that to actually improve the security of our endpoint configurations across the entire organization. So that was pretty interesting to see too. Now, that's the good stuff that came out of the test. With any incident like this, obviously there's always going to be some bad stuff as well. Okay. So on the bad side of things, while the incident was detected and contained, response time could have been improved. And was a little more alarming actually was that no normal users reported anything to the help desk, even though the AV infection prompts appeared on their desktop at the time the virus was detected. So you had a bunch of computers within the organization with the antivirus popping up a screen saying the PC was infected by a virus, and not one person bothered to call the help desk. So that was a little disappointing to actually see. But we're able to take both these good and bad lessons, though, and use them as a basis for improving the security of our organization, as well as for improving our incident response plan for how we're going to address future incidents. So some of the things we did in response to this particular simulated outbreak is, number one, the configuration of our antivirus software was updated to make the outbreak more noticeable to IT staff. Prior to doing this incident, we used to have email alerts go out. So if a virus was detected, IT was sent an email and so on. What we did after this incident to make it a little more noticeable to IT and to improve response time was we actually began to tie it to our ticketing system. So after this incident, we made it so any virus detected, it not only sent the email, but the email was used to open a ticket, which started to assign the ticket to people within IT to ensure it was looked at within a timely manner. We also did a lot of internal training, both within IT and with regular staff members, to better improve security awareness for the regular staff and what their role is in identifying issues like that and reporting into IT, as well as training with IT staff members so that they could detect and contain such an incident even quicker. The other good things that came out of it is a lot of IT staff members who didn't have a security background now better understood the need for certain security practices. So a lot of times you're going to deal with people who've worked in IT for a long time, but don't necessarily work in the IT security area or have familiarity with it. And doing exercises like this does provide a great way to introduce those people to why certain security practices are essential and important. And the big lesson that I really chose to focus on is, based on the results of the test, we're able to further harden the network infrastructure and endpoint infrastructure. And in particular, because that network segmentation stood out as being so effective, I kind of use this as the justification for moving towards a more zero trust model within the organization. So this kind of lays out the groundwork for what got me thinking about zero trust and why I started to go in that direction. Okay. Now, what zero trust is, zero trust enforces the creation of a perimeter around every network-enabled device to ensure that only pre-approved traffic flows are allowed. Basically, you're essentially putting a firewall or equivalent in front of each device and only allowing traffic to and from that device that is considered necessary for that device to function. So zero trust environments and the high level of network segmentation they require are an ideal way to help mitigate the spread of malware and other security threats, because communications between systems on the network will likely not even be possible unless there was already a legitimate use case defined in the firewall policies that control the communication between those systems. So as an example, PCs within your organization. The PC on user A's desk, odds are, does not need to communicate with the PC on user's B desk. You can cut off that communication, make it completely not possible, have really no impact on operations because there's no legitimate use case there, and at the same time make your organization far more resistant to cyber attack. And that's kind of the road that we began to go down at this point. So now that we know what zero trust is and why I decided to go down the road for zero trust, we'll go over a little about how I began to actually do that. Okay. Now, I'm going to go over each of these in a little more depth, but as an overall high-level view of the strategy, basically the steps to zero trust first involved identifying all the information systems, then identifying the data flows between the information systems. Based on the data flows that were identified, we could use that as a basis for creating policies for implementing the network segmentation. And then lastly, because I'm very big on simulated incidents and testing and actually ensuring that the security works, is we chose to then follow up with penetration tests and other stuff to actually demonstrate that the network segmentation we had put in place would withstand an attack. So the first and probably one of the most challenging parts of this actually is identifying where all your information systems are within the organization. Just answering the question of where is all your data. Very few organizations have a map of where all their data is and where all their data flows to. And if you don't have one, which I know we didn't either at the time, this is a very big effort to actually put together. And this is probably the hardest part about doing zero trust, is identifying those information systems and identifying all the flows between those information systems. And you'll find that it takes a lot more effort than just IT. It's very challenging for IT to do alone, because you're going to find a surprising amount of data might not even be under the direct control of IT. You might have HR systems, you might have finance systems, you might have some of these systems sending data back and forth to external vendors. Common things like for revenue cycle management or collections on bills, things like that. Not so much relevant to zero trust, but you may expose a lot of records that are still paper-based. And then there's always the question of shadow IT, which a lot of these exercises may help identify. And for a lot of hospitals too, you have to remember all the IoT devices we're now deploying, that this map should also include data because you have security cameras, you have medical devices, you have printers, there's all kinds of other devices on the list as well. So it's a fairly challenging exercise to actually do, to identify all those systems and then think about how those systems actually communicate with each other. This was also fairly challenging, identifying the data flows. Most of the work is probably in this area, is figuring out how the systems actually talk to each other once you identify them. There's several approaches we took to this. where possible, we were able to interview certain system administrators, talk to them and figure out, based on conversations with them, how the data went back and forth between their system and other systems. And if there's a competent system administrator there, this can be a very easy way to go about doing it. In some cases, we had to rely on the manufacturer's documentation, because that would tell you what ports and protocols that particular system needed to communicate on, and that could help you further refine how that data actually flowed. For other cases where there wasn't documentation or administrators who were as knowledgeable, we did often rely on things like collecting and analyzing net flow data to look at the communications back and forth between systems. If you're in a VMware environment, this wasn't available at the time I had done the Zero Trust approach, but they do make a product called vRealized Network Insight available now, which will actually look at all the traffic that goes back and forth to all the virtual machines you have in your data center. That's a fairly nice tool as well, because you can automatically make rules for things like NSX. In some cases, we even rely on things like Wireshark to actually packet capture and figure out where data was going back and forth to, because no one had a good record of how those systems communicated. So that's probably the biggest and lengthiest part of the Zero Trust challenge, is figuring out how all these different systems that you have within your organization, and for any hospital, there's going to be a lot of them, how they actually talk to each other.
Hey, Chris, this
Yes.
is Abs. How long did it take you to get through this process?
It's largely going to depend on how big your team is, how many systems you have, but this was the bulk of the work. I mean, we probably spent, from when we started Zero Trust to when we had a fairly complete picture of it, because I have a very small team, it was probably close to 18 months to 2 years in that range. But it's also, too, because we were cautious actually rolling it out, too. So we didn't just turn on Zero Trust all at once. It was done over time because we didn't want a chance breaking anything.
Yep. And so was the data flow analysis, was that kind of an ongoing iterative process, or did you do it in one chunk of work up front?
It was somewhat iterative, and I'll go over that in a bit, the approach I took to actually figuring out which systems to target first. So I'll come back to that question, actually, because I have a few slides on that a little later on.
Thanks.
Which I think will answer it. So, but basically, as we did this and identified the data flows, it's these data flows that became the basis for figuring out our network segmentation and our Zero Trust policies. And even if you have no interest in doing Zero Trust, I still think this is an exercise worth doing, because if you have a really good understanding of the type of traffic that should be happening on your network, it also makes a lot of the incident identification and other stuff much easier, because it becomes far, far easier to identify traffic that shouldn't be happening if you have a listing of everything that should be happening. So Zero Trust aside, it's a very useful security exercise for that alone. Okay. Now, in terms of how we approach the Zero Trust, we chose to start with the data center. So you could make a very good case for starting at the endpoints too. At the time, I had gone with the data center first, mostly because the hospital still had a lot of legacy systems housed in the data center, and that's where I felt the biggest risk was. But depending on your makeup, given that a lot of cyber attacks start with things like phishing and other stuff, you can make an equally valid case for starting from the endpoints and then working your way towards the data center. It really depends on the risk in your environment. But I'm going to cover the data center side first, because that's where I started within my organization. Okay. Now, our data center, we're pretty much 100% virtualized. And one of the real traditional security barriers to dealing with virtual environments was virtual environments were traditionally harder to secure with network access controls, because communications between virtual machines on the same physical host often occurred in the backplane of a server and never reached a switch or other network appliance. So you might have had rules in to prevent, let's say, virtual machine A from talking to virtual machine B within your switch or within your firewall. But if those two virtual machines sat in the same server, that communication may have never went through the switch or through the firewall, which often gave them a way to communicate that circumvented normal network access controls. So that was always one of the big challenges in virtual environments. In recent years, this is beginning to change with the introduction of software-defined networking and security products, things like NSX and Hyper-V network virtualization, and they've made approaching Zero Trust a lot more feasible, both in terms of their capability of handling virtual environments as well as the economics of it. Because a lot of these software-defined firewalls are far less costly than putting a physical firewall in front of every server to handle communications. Now, all my examples are going to be shown in VMware NSX because that's the product we went with. But as I mentioned, there are other products that you can do microsegmentation within the same manner. So the concepts apply pretty much regardless of which product you're using. So we decided to do Zero Trust with NSX. And NSX, their security portion of the product is basically called the distributed firewall. And it allows for each virtual machine to have a perimeter formed around it and for rules to be configured in the firewall to control communications to and from the virtual machine. So it literally lets you put a firewall in front of each virtual machine. So even if those two virtual machines are on the same host, those firewalls sit between those two machines. You can control what information is allowed in and out of each virtual machine. So you can protect virtual machines even if they're on the same host from other virtual machines on the same host. Now, to get back to the question that was asked earlier of where did we start, we decided to start with the most widely accessed systems with the most well-known ports and services first. So things like DHCP, DNS, NTP. The networking side of these systems is really well known. It's low-hanging fruit, but we figured it was a great way to learn the NSX product, to learn how it worked, things like that, and put these really simple rules in first. But at the same time, as we added rules to control communications to and from these machines, we still improved the security of our environment, and we built up from there. So we started with these really simple, really widely accessed systems first. Then what we did next is we did our virtual desktops next, largely for the simplicity reason as well. Virtual desktops, they're largely clones of each other in most organizations. So you figure out the rules necessary to protect one desktop, and you can pretty much roll those rules out to all your virtual desktops. Fairly easy way to secure a large part of your organization quite quickly. So after we did the well-known systems and the virtual desktops, we began to approach the highest risk systems yet next. So if you had any like old Server 2003 boxes or things like that that you're forced to keep around for some reason, we decided to segment those off next because they presented the greatest risk to the organization. And what we saved for last was kind of the lower risk but very complex systems. And that's what we kind of hit last within the data center. And that's pretty much the approach we took to securing that. Now, we wanted to go beyond the data center though as well. And we didn't just do this for our virtualized network infrastructure. We did this for our entire physical network as well. Now, on the physical side, putting a firewall in front of each device is not really financially feasible. It also becomes a little harder with throughput issues, things like that, to firewall everything off. So we took a little different approach. We decided to use a network access control appliance to do that. So in order to do this, we made use of network access control to create port-based policies that basically put restrictions in based on the type of device. So for example, PCs are allowed to connect to the subnet containing our EHR servers and our PAC systems, but they're not allowed to communicate with each other. So you can largely think of it like this. We have our servers, which are virtualized and protected by NSX. Those are on, let's say, a server VLAN. So the network access control appliance will allow PCs to communicate with that server VLAN and nothing else. And then the NSX microsegmentation within the server VLAN then controls which particular servers within that VLAN the individual PC is allowed to see. So we kind of have it so the two solutions work together. Okay. And we found largely that these network access control based policies were created for devices such as printers, security cameras, and that they worked well for devices that are basically widespread throughout the organization. So any device that you have a lot of, such as a PC, printers, security camera, things like that, this was a very good approach to handling that. And one of the really nice things about network access control too is they can control communications between devices plugged into the same switch. So unlike putting a firewall in front of a switch where the communication may never actually get to that firewall, the network access control allows us to protect a PC from another PC that's plugged into that same exact switch. So that was an advantage for this type of setup as well. And that's largely what we did for a lot of the physical network. And in our particular case, we have Extreme Network switches, so we did use their network access control appliance. For the physical network, though, too, we do make use of some internal firewalls as well. We do use this to control communications between subnets, as well as to control communications between some one-of-a-kind devices. So for the communications between subnets, I do like having some of the threat filtering and IPS type functionality built in. And for one-of-a-kind machines, you have a limited number of policies you can put in most switches if you're using NAC, so it doesn't pay to waste policies for a one-off. And sometimes a little inexpensive firewall does the job just as well for that. So that's basically the approach that we took together with the physical network, and that ties in with the NSX approach we did on the virtual side. Okay. Now, because I'm big on testing, once again, we did repeat the ICAR mock incident that we did. And in this particular case, only the endpoint to the script was launched from the impact. So only the endpoint the script was launched on was the impacted endpoint, basically. The ICAR test string didn't spread to any other computer. So it basically shows that the network segmentation does prevent the PCs from talking to each other, and that lateral movement has become significantly more difficult within our organization, which is one of the things that we were trying to achieve. Now, we wanted to build on this a little more too. I'm very big on defense in depth type stuff, and zero trust is a highly useful and effective security control for mitigating the spread of an attack. Zero trust, however, is not a panacea for all information security needs. So for example, a firewall will not protect the web server from being compromised if the attack comes in via port 80 or 443. So we also wanted to kind of extend this zero trust approach to other aspects of our data center as well. And by doing this, we've also been looking at application whitelisting and other type of defenses to basically control the functionality of systems in our environment to a certain baseline pre-approved functionality. And we've been using VMware App Defense to actually do a lot of that. So some of the criteria we had for choosing App Defense is I wanted something that was signatureless. Signature-based defenses are becoming increasingly ineffective. I think one of the latest Verizon data breach reports, they estimated that something like 70% of the malware an organization sees is unique to that organization. Signature-based defenses, they're really reactive only. They're not proactive at all. And the best you can really hope for a signature-based defense is being protected tomorrow against yesterday's threat. So they're not really a good way to do things. And we're looking for something that didn't rely on a signature. And I can walk you through some of the tests we did on App Defense to see how it worked before we deployed it. If you're not familiar with OWASP, they put out a lot of great security tools. And one of the tools they make available is called Mutillidae. And Mutillidae is a deliberately vulnerable web application for training security skills, basically. It allows pen testers to practice their skills before they go out and do a real pen test. So there's a bunch of flaws intentionally within this web application. So what we did is we installed Mutillidae on a virtual machine running XAMPP, which is basically a Windows version of Apache. And this was a fully patched Windows 2012 R2 virtual machine. We had one running App Defense, one not running App Defense, but they're equivalent in every other way. And we installed Mutillidae on this virtual machine. Okay. And what we did is then we let App Defense learn the behavior of this particular virtual machine for a period of 2 weeks. Real world, 2 weeks is a little short. You probably want to do some longer. I'd say about a month before you actually put this live on a real system. But for testing purposes, this was fine. And you can see from the screenshot here, it learns all the services that this virtual machine runs. And once we're comfortable that it's learned all the behaviors, all the services, it will learn network ports too. So you can kind of see here what ports each process communicates with, things like that. It'll learn IP addresses those communications come to and from. And once you feel it's sufficiently learned all the information it needs to know, you can basically turn this from learning mode into protection mode. And if it's not one of the services or one of the IP addresses or ports that are in this baseline description, it will block the behavior from occurring. And that's one of the things we had sought to test. So within the Mutillidae web application, one of the vulnerabilities that they have within the application is they basically have a part of the application where you can do a DNS lookup. And you enter a host name or IP address in this field, and it will return, if you enter the host name, it will return the IP address. If you enter an IP address, it'll return the host name and so on. And basically this DNS lookup function, all it does is it does an NS lookup system call. And one of the things about it, because it's intentionally vulnerable, is they don't sanitize the inputs in any way. So if we append an ampersand to the domain we put in, it allows us to run other commands after that. I'm doing something harmless here. I'm just launching Internet Explorer and sending it to the site google.com, but this was not an application that was part of that baseline that I had approved on the previous slide. So we run the OS command injection attack, and this works perfectly on the machine that did not have app defense, but we saw that on the machine running app defense with the application whitelisting, we saw that this actually was blocked. It issued an alert that an outbound connection was trying to be established that wasn't part of its baseline, and it blocked the service from launching. So that's kind of the direction we're going down now. We're extending that zero trust model more and more, not just to the network side, but to a lot of the applications that run in our environment. Okay. And even with this, we're big on keeping and testing and improving. Just to give you some ideas, here's another mock ransomware attack that we had done at one point. I won't go into depth in this one because I want to get to some of the medical device stuff before we run out of time. Okay. Now, I will say with medical device, as we mentioned earlier, with the WannaCry attacks and everything else, it's become quite concrete within hospitals that medical devices are just as much at risk, if not more at risk, because of a lot of the legacy nature of them, that they're just as much at risk as any other system within our environment. And I can tell you, even with a zero trust network, I mean, we've had some medical device instance here as well. Like here's an example of one. This is actually a screenshot from X-ray machine software, and it was a pretty simple case. We have a biomed department that maintains these devices. It's an older X-ray machine, and the hard drive gave out in the X-ray machine. They didn't have a copy of the original installed disks, so they got an image from another hospital that has the same machine. Now, they installed this image to the new hard drive. They put in the X-ray machine, and we found out that the image they got was pre-installed with the configure virus. Now, it went nowhere because of the network segmentation we have in place. This device wasn't really allowed to communicate with anything else because of that segmentation. Our DNS sinkhole picked it right up. We were able to remediate it, but it does really show that even in a very secure environment, you're still going to have things that are going to break your perimeter. You're still going to need a lot of the network segmentation, other controls to pick up and identify issues like this. Okay. Now, in terms of the medical device side, a lot of the medical device security started with what's called the Hippocratic Oath for Connected Medical Devices. That was put out a few years ago by a group called I Am the Cavalry, and they basically use this to reach out to the FDA and a lot of other government organizations to ask for medical devices that were much more secure by design. Recently, too, the FDA has put out a lot of guidance. They have pre- and post-market guidance now that includes cybersecurity recommendations for medical devices. And in my opinion, the guidance is a nice step in the right direction. But A, it's focused on manufacturers and not hospitals. And B, even if all manufacturers were to comply tomorrow, it's going to be years before any of us can replace every medical device we have with this supposedly more secure model. So it doesn't really solve the challenges we have hospitals have today. And so that's really the big question is, how do we secure medical devices today? How do we deal with securing them now? Because even if a device with all the security features in the world is put in place as well, it's still going to be insecure if it's not deployed in a secure manner. So we really need to figure out as hospitals what constitutes a secure medical device deployment. And I've done a lot of work in this area. It's published as the OWASP Secure Medical Device Deployment Standard. That's a shortened link to it. And version 2 is released back in August in conjunction with the Cloud Security Alliance. So it's gaining increasing industry adoption. Okay. I'm going to go through the controls pretty quick because I want to get to some of the other stuff in the presentation before we run out of time, and then leave a couple minutes for questionings. It focuses in areas like purchasing controls, because one of the best ways to eliminate vulnerability from your environment is to never introduce it in the first place. So it's really big on taking time to evaluate devices before you purchase them, as well as asking for things like a list of software components and questions about how the device will be supported by the manufacturer so you can better make security decisions. Likewise, it goes into things like perimeter defenses. Most medical devices really don't need internet access. They don't need to be public facing. Yet looks at search engines like Shodan and things like that find that a lot of hospitals have a lot of these systems publicly facing. So putting in the proper perimeter defenses to ensure that this is not the case. And it will go into depth about what some of those perimeter defenses are and how they can be configured. Lastly, internally, it does go into a lot of the network security controls. And once again, going back to that concept of flat networks and how we really shouldn't have it within hospitals. The average medical device may need to communicate with a few other systems within our environment to, output results, things like that, or maybe get patient data so the device knows who the next person who's going to take the test is going to be, things like that. But they don't need to communicate with every other system in our environment. So putting things like network segmentation and some internal firewalling, intrusion detection systems, DNS sinkholes, very big fan of that one as well, because one of the things is you can't run traditional endpoint security software on most medical devices. And even if the vendor runs it, it's not going back to one of your enterprise consoles. It's probably going to something of theirs. So a DNS sinkhole is a great way to figure out a medical device is compromised in a short period of time, because it will start alerting you that it's trying to connect to questionable websites. So it's something I really recommend. But it'll go through a lot of those controls as well on the network security side. The OWASP standard also goes into a lot of device security controls. So these are configuration changes you can make within the device itself. They're really basic things like changing default credentials, putting account lockout in place if you have it. Things like going back to the Mariah botnet, they used a list of just 61 passwords to break into hundreds of thousands of devices. There's no reason to suspect for medical devices it wouldn't be any different. So make sure Biomed does basic stuff like change the default passwords. If you have a compromised medical device, things like that, just having a backup of the device configs or a spare copy of the firmware. I mean, going back to that configure example I gave a few minutes ago, that would have solved a headache for me, my environment, things like that. You might find devices don't incorporate all this stuff, but encrypting storage, different user accounts versus admin accounts, restricting access to the management interface if it's possible. Does the medical device have an update mechanism? Is it turned on? You might want to do different audits or compliance monitoring on it. Is the device physically secure? Because they do have patient data, and somebody walking out with the device is still a potential data breach. What kind of asset management do you do for medical devices? Areas like that. The OWASP guide also covers things that can be done to secure interfaces and central stations, basically computers and servers that are often used to collect and transmit data to other systems in the environment. So you may have a bunch of heart monitors that send all their data to one station, let's say, for the nurse to see. So what are the criteria to harden those systems as well? These are particularly critical sometimes because a lot of times you'll find that devices are segmented off, but your particular interface or central station acts as a bridge to other systems on your network. So things that can be done to secure those systems. And the last part of the OWASP guide goes into security testing and incident response. Basically things you can do to prove that your deployments are secure and that you can actively respond to an issue if it arises. And I will show you guys a tabletop sample incident at the end of my slides. Things like doing pen tests on medical devices, or your setup around medical devices, having a medical device incident response plan. What happens if an infusion pump is compromised? How is your organization going to deal with that? What happens if medical devices start being denial of service? Do you have a way of dealing with that? And doing some of the mock incidents, or at least tabletop mock incidents, to actually walk through some of these plans and ensure that they can actually be handled well. Because a lot of this, you have to remember that these plans would involve far more than just IT or InfoSec. A lot of hospitals, there's biomed and all kinds of others. You have to involve physicians and other stuff. There's big patient care issues here that hospitals really, really need to talk through. Now, a question I get a lot is, we have all of those controls in the OWASP standard. So which controls should I do first? What controls should I prioritize? It's a very common question I get. And I've come up with a little bit of a way for hospitals to address that question. Very simple method of doing risk assessment on medical devices. And just ask yourself, did you remember to take your pills? Simple outcome to remember. And I see it as a really simple model for assessing the risk of medical device deployments. you want to consider the privacy of the data, the integrity of the data, the loss of availability, and the life safety implications of your medical device deployment. So in terms of the privacy of information, what ways can PHI possibly be obtained from information the device collects, processes, stores, or transmits? So as an example, maybe anyone can log in with a default password, or maybe transmissions can be intercepted because communication is not encrypted. So then you have to ask yourself, what controls can be put in place to prevent or mitigate the issues identified above? Changing all default passwords, one of the controls, or maybe encrypting data in transit. Or maybe if it can't be encrypted, maybe we do some kind of network segmentation or something else to prevent people from gaining access to the potential data coming across. Various questions like that. Based on your risk analysis, it'll help you identify a lot of the controls that need to be put in place. Similarly, for the integrity of information, ask yourself, in what ways can information collected, processed, or stored, or transmitted by the device be altered in an inappropriate way? So, such as the central station, which collects the data, does not authenticate devices before collecting and displaying it. What controls can be put in place to prevent or mitigate integrity issues such as the above? Maybe network segmentation or a NAC appliance could be used to restrict which devices can communicate with the central station. So the medical device may not support that functionality in and of itself, but we can build compensating controls around it. Likewise for loss of availability. In what ways can a loss of access to the device, a loss of access to the device's data, or a loss of device functionality result? Example, ransomware encrypted the device and it can no longer be used to monitor patients. And this happened quite extensively at WannaCry. A lot of hospitals actually lost X-ray equipment and other radiology equipment as a result of those attacks. So we ask ourselves then, what controls can we put in place to prevent or mitigate such a loss of availability? Maybe things like having your medical device on a regular patch cycle to reduce the vulnerability to ransomware, network segmentation to mitigate the spread of ransomware, putting an IPS or something else in front of legacy devices to virtually patch them, various things like that. So in other words, what, again, controls can we put in place to prevent that device from being affected in that particular situation? And last but not least, this is actually the most important one, in what ways can a cyber attack contribute to a life safety issue? While some may overlap with risks already identified, because there will be some overlap here, that ransomware attack that makes the device unavailable, in a lot of cases, can result in a life safety issue. Life safety risks are the ones that we really should prioritize above all others. So my answer to the question of which controls should I focus on first, if you do this assessment, it's any that fall into this life safety category. So as an example, the infusion pump is compromised and cannot be trusted to deliver the correct dose. So what controls can you put in place to prevent or mitigate such life safety issues? Maybe in this case, they have backups of known good firmware to restore it to the original state if it becomes compromised. And that's kind of the idea behind that. Now, I'm going to go through this really quickly because I only have a couple of minutes left. But the other thing I recommend hospitals do is a medical device tabletop. And this is the one we did at the CyberGuard conference a few weeks back. And starts out very simple tabletop scenario. A phishing email goes out to hospital executives and asks them to click a link. And we'll assume someone in the hospital clicks the link, and you can start to work through the tabletop issues here. Would this email be detected? Would it be reported? What controls exist to prevent or mitigate the infection of the endpoint? What kind of signature-based defenses do you have? Do you have non-signature-based defenses? Things like software restriction policies and things like that block potential malware based on the location the application tries to run. Stuff like trying to block applications from running within the user's profile. Non-signature-based, highly effective against a lot of malware. What actions would be taken if it was reported? And most organizations have pretty decent responses to those types of questions. Now we say network reconnaissance and lateral movement. So we assume that one PC, the link got clicked, PC becomes infected, and that PC begins to scan the network for other vulnerable hosts and begins to spread its infection. We're going to assume that none of this is visible to the users of these systems, and there are no network performance issues reported by end users. But we'll assume that the newly infected hosts try to establish connections with some command and control servers. So how could this be detected? Would your organization actually detect this attack? Does enough network visibility exist? Does adequate logging exist? are those logs routinely monitored? Because some organizations, they do log data, but no one ever looks at them. And ask yourself, honestly, do these things apply to your organization? What could you do to detect this or to improve this? Are there any in-place controls to prevent this? Any network segmentation? Any monitoring to pick up like a DNS sinkhole, some of the command and control traffic, anything that would detect the unusual communications within the network? Now we're going to assume that 3 weeks later, after the virus and malware has spread through the organization, the attackers start to launch their attack. And so around 3 a.m. one night, a nurse reports an issue with a telemetry monitor hooked to one of our ICU patients. About the same time, security notices that a couple of security cameras have gone offline. And engineering receives a report of a pressure sensor in an isolation room that seems to be malfunctioning. Now, one of the issues here, and this is where it shows the real importance of communications between departments within a hospital in dealing with a cyber attack. And this is the part that most hospitals, in my experience, fail really badly on, is would any of these events independently trigger thoughts of a cyber attack? And the answer in most cases is probably no. And would anyone even be made aware of all 3 of these events, or would they be reported to different departments? A lot of hospitals, the telemetry monitor report goes to biomed. The video camera report would go to security. The pressure sensor, it goes to facilities or something along those lines. And you might have the warning signs of a cyber attack with all those devices going down, but there might not be any one person in the hospital who's aware of all 3 things simultaneously because of how the hospital communications are laid out. So how would these events be responded to? And in a lot of cases, the honest answer for hospitals is they wouldn't be, because people would just independently look at them and not think anything of it. And at 3 a.m., a lot of us would probably wait till morning when it was too late. So, later in the day, systems continue to malfunction and drop off the network. Many security cameras and telemetry monitors are down. Infusion pumps are starting to fail. Lab equipment starts to fail, etc. So at what point, would your organization consider a cyber attack? Would the potential impact on other systems, such as infusion pumps, not have been considered while telemetry monitoring troubleshooting was ongoing? So would biomed be working so hard on one system that they weren't even considering that the threat might spread to other biomedical systems? What actions would be taken? How would the incident be contained? Do the tools even exist in your environment to contain the incident? How would those actions impact patient care? Very, very important question, and something that needs to involve more than just IT. And I know I went through the tabletop really fast, but I want to leave for 5 minutes for questions. And like I said, I'll happily send the slides out after the talk. I'll PDF and send them out. And if you want to follow up with any questions as well, there's my contact information there.
Well, Chris, that was fantastic. I know somebody's going to have some questions.
Yeah, I went through a lot really fast, but tried to get it all in.
Oh, that was great. Then, in terms of the net cost of Zero Trust, do you have any sense of what kind of increase in cost you had from both a capital, hardware, software, as well as a operating expense increase, additional headcount, or any other OpEx? What did it end up costing you?
It's actually a mix, I guess, and it somewhat cancels out because, yes, there are more costs associated with adds, moves, and changes now because it does involve more work. But at the same time, there's also, less security responses, things like that, because everything's contained. So it's somewhat a balancing act. The question with a lot of security stuff too is always the unknown. Is you're dealing against your cost versus your risk. So I think it dramatically lowers the risk, and that more than offsets it. But yeah, there has been some obvious increase in terms of how long it takes to deploy systems, things like that, because you might have to edit rules or put rules in place. But at the same time, the number of incidents we had to respond to has also dropped dramatically as well.
And that's the next piece of it. In terms of benefit, what kind of metrics can you share with us as far as reduction of incidents or anything like that?
The public share, it's basically I've repeated the mock incident that we've done before. We've redone that. The containment was shown to work that way. I have had it pen tested as well to show that it works. Where we did get the pen tester we gave him basically simulated an attack where we gave him local access to a regular account to a PC, and his job was try to escalate privileges and then use that to escape and compromise other machines. And he was able to basically compromise the machine that he was given access to eventually, but he couldn't escape because the PC didn't have access to anything else. So that kind of showed some of the network segmentation, did work. And I guess the other example I gave was the configure worm that popped up in the environment and didn't go anywhere. And that was a threat that, through totally unforeseen circumstances of biomed taking an image from another hospital, clearly broke our perimeter and bypassed all those controls and popped up in the organization, and it did keep it contained as well.
Awesome.
Hi, this is John Zimmerly from Cincinnati Children's. In terms of numbers of servers or endpoints, can you kind of speak to what the size of your environment is and what you had to segment off? Sure.
Servers were about 250 servers and endpoints close to 2,000.
Okay.
In terms
Thank you.
That's PC endpoints. I'm not including like printers and cameras and other stuff. Then it gets much bigger.
And would you be able to kind of give a rough estimate, kind of how many different VLANs those endpoints live in?
In the range of probably 18 to 20.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Hi, Chris. This is Craig Carver from the Christ Hospital. Did you guys have a SOC, build a SOC as part of this effort, and kind of what was needed for the increased alerting this visibility started giving you?
We actually have that mix because I have security staff here during the day, but not at night. So we use the managed service also as part of that because I do like the 24/7 monitoring. So we do export a lot of our syslog to a managed service who does a lot of the monitoring with one of their SIMs, mostly because I want to be called at 4 a.m. if something happens and I'm not on site or one of my staff is not on site. So it's actually a mix in our environment.
Did you have to increase that mix or more staff from an operations standpoint? We're kind of seeing that if we gain this visibility and alerting on suspicious behavior, we think we're going to see more. That's just kind of our gut feel.
I think you may see more in the short term, but long term with the zero trust is a lot of that behavior is blocked by default.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Well, Chris, thanks a lot. This has been fantastic. I applaud you on a job well done there at Interfaith. And again, thank you so much for your time and sharing your story with us.